it feels like we're not getting anywhere. But working in Vermont and in rural New England may not feel like that, because we're not working at the epicenters where people are seeing gun trauma every day. But I'm going to give you some information, some data that might make you think about that problem differently. So disclosures. So I'm on a bunch of committees. It's all pro bono. I am CEO of a new organization called the FIRM, the American Foundation for Firearm Introduction Medicine. We fund gun violence research. It's all pro bono, so no financial conflict of interest. So we'll start with the epidemiology, the scope of the problem, some successes in the past, what the research is like today, and then what we can do now. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that our paradigm for this problem is underdeveloped. There are a lot of problems with the way we address the problem of gun violence in this country, and it starts with the way that we frame it. Because what we're doing is we're measuring gunshot wounds. And this is our training as under physicians. Somebody gets shot, which is the, what's this one? Somebody gets shot, we resuscitate, and then we move on. And this is what we're counting when it comes to epidemiology. These are numbers from 2016. They're pretty bad numbers. About 38,000 people were killed by firearms in 2016, which is almost the same number of people that died by opioid overdoses in that period of time, and as many as who died from motor vehicular trauma. We know that guns have a higher rate of fatality than any other injury. For every 2 people injured, 1 is killed. For most types of injuries, it takes 10 to 50 people who are injured for 1 death to result. Yes. That's fine, yeah. Okay. And we see this also reflected in this data. This is patients treated by mechanism in U.S. trauma centers. And only 4%, only 4% of patients seen in trauma centers are due to firearms. So why do we care about 4%? Because they have the same mortality rate. And deaths and injuries from guns are increasing in the country, whereas deaths from every other injury syndrome are decreasing. This slide speaks for itself. It came last month in the CDC and published in the New York News. Almost 40,000 people died with firearms last year. And what's interesting, this relates to us in rural America, is that firearm mortality rates are actually higher in rural America. Non-metro, metro. And that's because of suicide. Because more people die of suicide in rural America than they do in urban America. And why is that? Is it because people are more unhappy in rural America? Or is it because we have more guns? So 10% of people who attempt suicide will die by any other means besides guns will die of suicide, whereas the statistic is flipped. And we know that in the acute phase, people who are depressed are more reactively suicidal, especially if it's on the first attempt. And we know that about 1/3 of suicides are successful on the first attempt. And about 51 to 53% of suicides are attempted with firearms, which are pretty successful. In Vermont, 59% of suicides are attempted with firearms. And we see that in our state stats. We have about a 35% higher suicide rate in Vermont than the rest of the country. This map shows how firearm death rates, again, are clustered in rural America, not in the urban areas. And in 2016, about 155,000 people's lives were ended or degraded by firearms. This is what everybody talks about. This is what we're all worried about, is active shooters. And this is a study from the FBI from 2015. And it shows this increasing trend. An active shooter has a particular definition. It means a situation in which somebody is actively trying to shoot as many people as possible in a public setting. It is not necessarily a mass shooting, which is a different definition. There's a 2018 report that showed that this trend has actually gone up. In 2017, in the 16 and 17, there were 50 incidents of active shooters and 1,000 casualties in 21 states. So it's funny, in the 2018 report, they didn't put this graph on. because I think it would look more like that. So mass shootings. So they change the definition of these things from time to time, and it's just to serve law enforcement and how they process these things in jurisprudence. But currently, the definition of mass shooting is 4 or more people, excluding the killer, are killed. About 2% or less of all the deaths due to gun violence in this country are due to mass shootings. But unfortunately, the number of mass shootings are increasing. And we do know that most mass shootings come from domestic violence, which, we see those patients in the ER, those who are at risk. So do we have an adequate understanding of the problem? I mean, are we measuring the right things? And so let's start by looking at costs. And so there's some studies that have shown the direct medical cost of gun violence. Here's one that showed that about $630-something million a year is spent on the initial hospitalization of gunshot wounds. A third of them are private insurance, so it's not all Medicare and Medicaid. This is another study that showed ED and inpatient, and it's $2.8 billion a year on average between 2006 and 2014. In Colorado, they had a 50% increase in cost over 5 years. 2012, 17 million, now it is 26 million. So what we aren't measuring is the other part, is injury arc, because after resuscitation, they go to the morgue or they go to rehab. And so it's really hard to measure what is the long-term care colostomy and all the readmissions and all the complications of that. So that's not measured. The PTOT, the readmissions, and then we also know that communities that have high rates of gun violence have worse healthcare outcomes overall. Because if you're living on the south side of Chicago and there's a shooting, there's going to be retaliation. So you're not going to go to the doctor, you're not going to go to the store, you're not getting your meds. So they have worse outcomes for asthma, diabetes, hypertension. And these are measured in the costs. So there are also real and direct costs associated with the primary and secondary victims of gun violence. So secondary victims, witnesses, family members, they suffer physical and mental health consequences that are not very well measured. So I work in a couple hospitals. I've worked in New York, Massachusetts, Vermont. And I once took care of a person who was shot pretty much at point blank range and could not resuscitate the person. And you know how it is when you give the news, and it's really kind of painful to go out to the family and tell them that somebody who was young, healthy, and an active participant in their lives is no longer there. And so it was a terrible situation, and somebody who I'm giving the news to throws herself on the floor. And 4 months later, that person came in as an OD in our department. And she's not counted in the metrics of gun violence, but I know that she counts because she was there. Actually, she was a witness. So there are many direct and indirect medical costs that are still not being measured here. So, and this is, we know that trauma is heavy. Like, we all carry around baggage from that, damaged goods, that's why I'm doing this. There's some studies that demonstrate that physicians and trauma surgeons who respond to mass shootings test positive for stress syndromes and sometimes PTSD. It's not very good for physical wellness, and that contributes to burnout. And then there are the costs of threat assessments. So these are real and direct costs as well. So this is a case from my town, Bennington. I'm from Bennington. Report of man with gun places school, bank under lockdown. Police resolve situation quickly. No injuries or threats. Man taken to hospital. That means whoever's here, right? Whoever's at the shop. Whoever's working the shop. And at that time in Bennington, we didn't have any psychiatry on call, so we were on our own. This was not my case. I do know this case. But I've had many cases like this. And so what happens when you have this case? What's important to know that, okay, so this guy didn't break a law. When you're done with him, either you discharge him from the ER or you're going to admit him somewhere, he is going to go home, he's going to have his gun. Because he's a legal owner, didn't break a law. So think about that when you make your disposition, right? Because we're accountable for outcomes. And someone's going to look back at us and say, hey, why did you let that guy go who went and then hurt himself, hurt his spouse, shot up a workplace, right? So what happens also is so this person, let's say, gets admitted, right? And you're going to commit him to a psych facility in Vermont. So what does that mean? It means you're going to board him for a long time. So he's going to be in your department for days, and then he'll go away someplace. And these are direct costs, right? There are costs of taking care of that person. There's opportunity costs because that bed is occupied by somebody that's not being taken care of. That's not by somebody who's stable. We had, this is a little bit offshoot of a rant, but we had a psych boarder when I was in Bennington that was in the ED for so long, got a DVT. It's like, we don't have any kind of like DVT prophylaxis guidelines for ED patients. We should. But anyway, this gets to something that's really important, all right? Because this guy was brought to us ahead of a shooting. So we know people have risk factors. Risk factors escalate. And if we can intervene here, then this doesn't happen. And I know this is true because I've seen this, right? I mean, many of us have probably seen something similar, where it's like, wow, that guy's in the ER. And there's more than 100 known risk factors for violence. And there are patterns of escalating risk that we can identify. And this is where our problem is. And we'll come back to the slide a little bit towards the end to get in more detail. So other medical costs, all right? Active shooter events. So Dartmouth had an active shooter in their ICU last year. How much did that cost? Like they had to shut down the place, and then everything got like moved around. And how much did that cost? I have no idea. We all have code silvers now, right? How much does it cost to generate a code silver? Anybody have an idea? Neither do I. There's really any good accounting on that. So I was a director of IT at a hospital years back when they drafted a code silver plan. It was about back of the envelope number was about $100,000 for a small hospital. Only $25,000 came from a Homeland Security grant. The rest came from operating budgets of the hospital, which meant patient care. And so how much does it cost when we drill an active shooter plan? The opportunity cost when we're all like doing this drill thing and not taking care of patients and generating RVUs. And this happens not just in hospitals, but in schools and workplaces many times a year. And then infrastructure costs. How much does it cost to retrofit windows in your ER that are bulletproof? I have no idea. It's got to be a lot of money. But anyway, these are a lot of costs that we're not really measuring. And then there's this. How much does it cost to shut down an airport? I bet a lot. And these 9 people that got trampled in a mall, they had medical costs that were not contributing, that are not estimated in the cost of gun violence. So the end of the day is like, there are a lot of costs. And this is also really important because we know that shootings inspire other shootings. There's retaliations, and we've been working from Chicago, and every time there was somebody who was shot, you had to go on lockdown because somebody's going to try to come and finish us off, or there's going to be something else that came out of it. And then they are people who think, oh, that's a really good idea. I want to do that. And if you do forensic evaluations of mass shooters, they want to one-up the one that came before them. And each one of these things has its own consequences. Back when I kind of got started on this topic, I had 2 cases that came in close succession. One right after Newtown, and then one 2 weeks later, and both had some media on that. And I realized that, wow, there's a pattern here, that this is infectious. And then this came out. It showed that there's an increase in probability of another shooting within 13 days in the public media. And so I've seen this. And I'm sure other people have, but none of us are counting these episodes of near misses as if we know what a near miss is. So there are trends of infection, and if we can find ways to interrupt them, then maybe we can be successful. So I'm proposing a different model for gun violence. All right, it's a hot mess. It's very complicated. And so we have no idea the true cost. We don't have a grip on this problem. And this is kind of reflected in the costs. These are studies. This is something I put the search results at the end of this. But this is studying here the NIH and CDC funding for 2015, what was spent by the federal government, and these are studies that demonstrate the estimate cost. And this came from a guy from Mother Jones News, $229 billion for gun violence at that time, but it didn't include all those other costs that were mentioning. So this actually is like way bigger. We're spending a lot more now on opiates, right? I mean, NIH spent about $500 million in research in 2016. And then they spent $800 million in CDC programs. So we're spending north of $1 billion a year on this problem, which kills, a lot of people. Not that many more than guns. But it doesn't make any sense. So anyway, so what do we do when we have a hot mess? We invest in the process to figure out what works to prevent and treat it. This is our toolbox, and it works every time. The public health approach. You define the problem. What the causes, who's at risk, when and why, what works for whom, and then you scale up the interventions. You just do that, and it works every time. Like motor vehicle accidents used to kill 50% more people, and we didn't take away anybody's cars. I mean, HIV used to be a death sentence, and now it's a disease that you can live with. And the important thing to note is that before there were drugs, we intervened on behaviors, and we decreased the incidence of HIV before the drugs came aboard, and we didn't ask people to stop having sex. And 50 years ago, right, pediatric child abuse, 50 years ago we didn't have child abuse as a medical construct. It was beat up kids and bad parents. But now we have layered interventions all across the healthcare safety net to intervene and give guidance and support, and our numbers of severe physical and sexual abuse have declined. So we know this works, but we know it doesn't work is what we're doing here. This is essentially what we're not doing. Like we know, we do research, we create guidelines, we educate people ourselves, we scale things, we create standards. People want to use our information for policy, great, and then we save lives. And you can't solve a crisis without actually going through this process. So, you have to invest. So why aren't we? What's different about this problem of violence? And it starts here. It's called the Dickey Amendment. So back in the 1990s, some guys did some study with CDC money showing that there was a negative association between health outcomes with gun access and home and femicide and other things. And it was done with CDC money, and it didn't look really good for some people that didn't like those results. And so in Congress, they put this rider into an omnibus bill saying that you can't use any CDC money to advocate or promote gun control. Fine, right? You can't use research money for anything but research. But what they did with this is the money that was in gun violence research at that time was taken out and put into traumatic brain injuries. So they kind of showed the CDC that they'll defund them and mess with their budget if they do this again. And I mean, it was great that traumatic brain injuries in 1996 got a confusion of cash because we didn't have a grip on that back then. But now we do, right? Concussions are a big deal. We have great systems for addressing it and rehabilitation. But this went into effect in 1986 and it hasn't changed. In 2001, they put some restriction on NIH and the funding went way down. Sandy Hook happened in 2013. In 2014, Obama says, CDC needs $10 million a year to start studying this problem, and it doesn't get funded by the House because the House controls appropriations. 2018, again, nothing happened. This is from a CDC site. This is essentially the budget for gun violence prevention research. And so essentially, this is a JAMA article from a couple of years back. Kind of shows how much we're spending for gun violence based on the injury burden compared to other things with similar injury burdens. We spend tons of money. As many people die from sepsis as gun violence, and we spend billions and billions on sepsis. Right? We treat it, and we're getting better at it. But anyway, we have 1% essentially of predicted funds spent on this topic that should be there. This actually kind of was out of line, but this shows that there was an attempt last year again to fund this topic, and it was turned down by the House Appropriation. So it's different. So, but what can we do today? Like really, we can actually just fix the problem because we all agree, all the professional medical organizations agree that this is a public health problem. So we can do that. There's consensus amongst every medical organization. The surgeons have always been up front on this, the ones in the front line, along with us. And they did multiple surveys of their membership, showing that they all agree that it's a problem. 43% of the college surgeons, the American college surgeons that can begin trauma are firearms. A third of them had a family member or somebody, friend, injured or killed with guns. And they all think it's a big priority, and they all think, yeah, we should be able to fund this. And everybody's kind of agreeing on that, but again, the results are the same. So what do you do if you have this problem when you look at your options? This is anatomy of funding for research for all medical research, and it shows that about 58% comes from biotech and pharma, 4% charity, and then the rest comes from CDC, states, and NIH, and so on. What's available for gun violence prevention? Well, they don't have any interest in it, and there's not that much there. But again, states are now starting to come on board. California is funding some. There is a little bit of money in NIH. And then there's the charitable foundations, but most of them in the past have studied gun policy, like what gun control works. They didn't study risk factors. So ostensibly, I mean, there are trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in private philanthropy. And if you can raise hundreds of millions for breast cancer and ALS, which are really important causes, why shouldn't we be able to do that for gun violence, which is one of the greatest, most pressing public health challenges of our time? And there are signs now that the private sector is starting to respond. Kaiser Permanente put out $2 million last year. They worked with the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to work on a research agenda, and their first RFPs are going out this year. The Arnold Foundation put out $20 million last year, saying we're going to create this research collaborative. They're going to be funding all sorts of different things, including public health stuff. And they're going to raise another $30 million from other philanthropies, and that's great, and there are more signs the private sector is really looking to respond. And this guy gave $1 million. But the problem is right now is if people want to donate to fix the problem, their options are advocacy, which is where that went, victims funds, and blood drives. Like you can't really invest in the people that can solve the problem. It's all important, but you just can't invest in fixing the problem. And we know that to fix the problem, we have to go through this process. And it all starts with getting the research done. And so these are the organizations that can actually operationalize change. So the idea is like, well, let's just get everybody on the same page, aggregate funds, aggregate the expertise, and just get the work done. Right? Why can't we just go to the private sector or public sector or whoever and get the work done? And this is the organization that I co-founded in a week. So we want to make it very easy for people to invest in solutions. So, but until we have many millions of dollars of research, what can we do? Well, we know first, that there are people at risk. So being a man, being a minority, being young. What's not in this group are the mentally ill. People who have suffered from mental illness are more likely to be victims of gun violence than perpetrators. From studies of patients that we see in the ERs, we know that many are high risk. We know that kids, including suicidal kids, have access to guns. Teens who've been in fights, battered women, and people with Alzheimer's patients. So we see these people. And then we know that some things work. Like if we give them some counseling and trigger lock, then the parents will let them use them, so maybe you can decrease accidental shootings. There are some trauma service interventions that can decrease the rate at which kids carry weapons after fights. Families will take better care of their firearms if they have suicidal teens, if they're adequately counseled. And there are a number of resources out there that kind of will give guidance to physicians and individuals on how to address that. And this is important because we know that suicide is largely impulsive. Right, so if we have somebody who actually asks their patients about firearms, if they have access, a few, right? I mean, there aren't really guidelines for that sort of thing because, well, what happens when you screen positive? Like then what? Right? It's kind of on you to figure out what you're going to do. But the thing is, it can make a huge difference because most people, 70% of all suicides are done within the first hour of thinking about it. And we had a case at our shop this summer. A person who had no prior formed cognitions of suicide developed cognition of suicide, had access to a gun, and used it. And one hollow-tip bullet ended in 45 units of packed blood products and 7 surgeries. And she's doing really well right now, but that wouldn't have happened if we had addressed this. We can also talk to parents about making sure that where their kids play, that they have firearms that are secured. And there's data showing that it's also effective. So what we can do today is actually just talk to our patients about firearms and counsel them on safe behaviors. And until we have structured guidelines for this problem, we have to do what we can. And there are ways to go about doing it. Like if you're going to ask, you make sure you let them know why you're asking. Right? You don't want to ask a diabetic who's coming in for a foot ulcer about firearm access because, well, it's irrelevant unless they're suicidal, right? So you need to be non-judgmental, you need to be apolitical, and just matter of fact. But what you can do depends on which state you live in. Massachusetts, for example, I work in 2 states, so if I have a suicidal patient in Vermont, I say, you know what, let's get the gun out of the house, and I'll talk to the patient's brother or wife and say, take the firearms out of the house, and it's never been a problem. But if I do that in Massachusetts, where everybody who has a gun has to have a permit, then I ask that person to break the law. So states all have to have their own approach to dealing with this problem, their own guides. And Massachusetts did this two years ago, and a number of other states are looking to replicate that process so everybody knows, like, okay, what are the laws for you when you advise people about taking care of this problem. The AMA has a site. This is actually a pretty decent module that kind of takes you through a number of scenarios where there's a risk and how to talk about risk. The University of California, Davis also has a good site. And this is a program that has a lot of promise. These are hospital-based violence intervention programs. These are system-based approaches that partner with community. And they've demonstrated about a 40% decrease in recidivistic violence when they have these programs rolled out. But there needs to be subgroup analysis, which population works better. This needs more research. These are in mostly major medical centers. I don't think Vermont has one, but like Boston Children's Hospital and UCLA. So I'm going to go back to this slide because this is relevant to all of us. And this relates to taking into action. Like you have a patient now who's intimating homicidal ideation. Okay, what do you do? So this has happened to me probably 24 times in the last several years working in different states. And these people are brought to us by families, by schools, by employment, by cops, because they want us to intervene on the problem that they can't prevent with laws or with other means. So we don't have decision guidelines, we don't have algorithms, and it's something that every time you get, you're kind of stuck. Has anybody had to deal with a situation like this where you're brought to somebody? Okay. It happened to somebody in Porter just last week. So there was a valid threat to shoot up the school in Millbury, and the patient, one of the alleged perpetrator, was taken to Porter Medical Center for psychiatric counseling and follow-up. So we have no idea how often this is happening, but it'd be good to know because then we can actually start measuring it. There were 43 threats against schools last year in Vermont that we know of. Right? There might have been threats where you heard about it from a patient, but then never made the level of police. But these are the ones we know about, and we're a small state. So there is an approach to violent risk assessments that's quite elaborate, and it's usually a half-day training course with forensic psychiatrists. The important features is that you've got to get a sense of the context of this. Is this a new psychosis? Is this something that is on a trajectory and crescendo? You need to talk to family, get collateral information. You need to create a certain kind of concept in your own mind of just how much risk is there, because that's going to impact what you do next. So there are static and dynamic risk factors for violence. They can't change these. If you're abused as a child, it's a risk factor. Brain injuries, impulsiveness, and how even in forensic psychiatry, what valence you accord to each one of these risk factors is a matter of judgment and experience. There are dynamic risk factors, and these are the ones that you can actually maybe mitigate, right? If they have alcohol abuse, then maybe you can get them sober. If they have a new psychosis, you can get them treated, right? And maybe you can get them walk back from the problem. Gun access is a risk factor, right? And in particular, what cognition's about and what behaviors with guns are these people doing? That's going to make you concerned. Right? And then let's say at the end of the day, you've got like, I estimate this person's risk is moderate. Well, I don't have advice for you. You can't stop. So there are a couple of things, right? If there's a high risk, if you think it's high risk, then you can inform law enforcement, right? So HIPAA guides how we give out personal information, right? So we need patient consent to report health information unless it's mandated by the state. The state can say, if gunshot wounds, you have to report that. TB, child abuse, you report that, fine. Also, if there's a serious imminent threat against somebody else, you can report that. But in that context, you can only give the minimum necessary information to a person who can actually lessen that threat, like the police, the potential victim. This is Tarasov, so I think most people know that. There was a case from like the 1970s where a psychiatrist knew about a patient that was threatening a woman, didn't advise the woman he murdered her, and then the psychiatrist held liable. So we are liable for the outcomes of our patients, and there's actually a lot of case law that's coming up, mostly against psychiatrists, but in multiple states. In Washington, Vermont, we had a case where physicians are being held responsible for the future harmful acts of their patients in malpractice. So it's been messy. But there's a new tool in our toolbox in Vermont, and it's an extreme risk protection order. So what these are petitions that are filed by family members through police. And it depends on state by state. There's 13 states that have this right now, where like a mom says, my son, he's just not right, and he's at a crisis point, and she calls 911. The police come out, and they say, this kid's not right. There's high risk here, and they call a judge. The judge says, you should take the guy's guns, and they take the guy's guns away. So they decrease the risk of firearm injury in that moment in time. And this person has due process to get the guns back by some legal process. But then what happens next? Then it's up to the discretion of the cop. Do you leave them at home? Is the threat all gone, or is there still a threat and the patient ends up in the ER on a welfare check? My experience has been they come to the ER on a welfare check, and that's what happened in Porter last month. And this is into the law. I mean, this is what constitutes high threat, and only cops can actually do the petition. The family has to request it, and then the cop has to kind of follow through. These are all things that we deal with. Like, we ask these questions. We get a sense of this when we see patients in mental crisis in ED. So, what do we do? Like, what if we're the only ones that know that? We don't really have guidance for that right now. But maybe if you can talk to a family member, you can get them on your side, and they can help get the patient disarmed for a period of time until everyone's got it figured out this is safe or not safe. So since the law came out in April, there have been, between April and October fiscal year, there were 8 extreme risk protection orders requested, and since then I think there's been another 6. So this is an ongoing problem. But do they work? And we don't really know yet. I mean, there's some good studies out there. There's one of Connecticut, which had the law, that said that, for and this is a high-risk population they're studying, but for every 10 gun seizures that are done, they can prevent a suicide. Now, this definitely needs to be validated and all that stuff, but it looks pretty good. Like an NTA 10 to prevent death, that's pretty good. And so, what about for intimate partner violence, or mass violence, or school violence? I mean, wouldn't it be great to know? I mean, that's a state I would love to fund. But one day. So, in summary, there's a lot that we don't know, but we have a lot of opportunities. But we can't solve a crisis without investing in the process to figure out what works to prevent it. This is our job, right? If we don't do this, who's going to do it? And my vote is that we just go out and get it done. Thank you.